Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and welcome to the Midday magazine show. My name is Burhan, and I'm your host today. So let me start by, first of all, introducing my co-host, who's also my guest today, and also my wife, is Rifka.
Hey, assalamu alaikum, everybody.
And this is our first show for this year's Ramadan Radio. And just to explain what the Midday Magazine show is before we get into the subject for today. Midday Magazine show is basically, we're going to have various topics over the course of Ramadan. There's no one particular subject that we're going to be covering like we did last year. And it's a midday and it's a magazine show. So we're going to have various guests, various subjects. So throughout the course of Ramadan, we're going to be talking about education, like today. We're going to be talking about what it's like to be an expat in the Muslim world, looking at Turkey, looking at the Gulf region. We have a show coming up about healthy living, nutrition, sports and exercise. We have a show about careers, graduate recruitment. So hopefully we're going to cover quite a lot of interesting things, which we hope you will find interesting and will tune into. But today's topic, I'm going to start off with something very interesting, which is around literacy, around reading, around the importance of reading, which, as we know, just in terms of our own lives is very important, but also from an Islamic point of view, it's critical to our deen and to Islam. But we're not going to be talking about it just from a sort of deeny sort of point of view. We're talking about it from a more general perspective. The importance of reading, the importance of getting our kids interested in reading, how reading affects the wider education of our children. And then we're going to expand it a little bit with a couple of guests we have coming on later in the show to talk about some book recommendations, and also how education is wider than just the school and academia and hothousing towards having high grades, which seems to be the way things are going at the moment. I'll allow Rifka to introduce herself, and then we'll start with our discussion.
So I'm a secondary school English teacher, have been for kind of over a decade, and I've also got a master's in education, and currently I'm going through like a reading phase and trying to make it sort of central to all of the children in my school. So that's my kind of focus at the moment.
Excellent, thank you. And just to let you know, if you want to join us, if you want to ask any questions, if you want to make any comments, you can join us on www.ramadanradio.org or on Facebook, facebook.com/Ramadan Radio London. We're also on 87.9 FM, and there's an Android app that you can also download and listen to us on there. But please do interact. Please do send in your questions and your comments, and they will pop up on our screen, and we'll address them the best we can. Okay, so maybe we can just start off with the importance of reading, where reading kind of fits in the education ecosystem. Are our kids reading? Is it different for this generation from our generation? Is it different for different parts of the socioeconomic groups?
So I think reading is something which my generation, so people who are like sort of 30s, 40s, 50s, right? Almost 50s. So that it's something that we grew up doing. It was like you didn't have all of these distractions with sort of like your phones or your internet or all of this kind of thing. It was basically, reading was, if you wanted to do something which was at home on a rainy day, you'd basically open up a book. And going to the library, I think, was fundamental to most of our Saturday mornings. So a lot of people grew up with that kind of culture where it was instilled in you to read. This generation, they've got so many distractions, so many other things which are going on, which is why, unless it's like a key focus for parents and a key focus for teachers, it gets put on the back shelf. There are 100 million sort of more exciting things that you can do with your time than read, but it hasn't changed, sort of all this technology hasn't changed the fact that reading is actually a fundamental part of your building blocks for education. You can't get anywhere without being really good at reading. And conversely, it's like if you're bad at reading, it will hinder every single part of your educational life.
Can you explain that a bit more?
So it's people sort of put reading into like English, right? So it's part of English.
Yeah.
So as a subject, they only think of reading as being something part of the English curriculum. However, unless you can read, you can't access any other parts of the curriculum. You're no good at your science or your maths or anything if you can't access the language. Similarly, you said something about socioeconomic sort of differences in terms of reading. One of the main indicators between somebody who is advantaged and disadvantaged is their vocabulary gap. So the difference in the amount of words that they know. And this gap between children who are advantaged and disadvantaged, it appears as early as like whatever, 3, 4. And by the time you're 7, kids who are advantaged have 7,000 words in their bank, and kids who are disadvantaged have about 3,000 words. And that gap just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then by the time you get to your GCSEs, it's a huge gulf, which is very difficult to make up. And this is where reading comes in, as reading is the key way of making that gap up. So even if you're not from a wealthy background, you don't have a great deal of books at home, even if you're working 2 jobs or you've got other reasons why you haven't got that many books at home, if you can find a way to get your kids into reading, you're going to be doing a massive favor to them.
So what do you think at the moment is stopping, apart from the obvious like things like social media, what's stopping children being interested in reading? Is it just distractions, or is it because reading has become something which, for instance, it's become like, a chore? It's like, wash the dishes, empty the washing machine, do your reading. And so it's seen as, a chore or almost like a punishment than anything else.
It's become, kids have associated it in their minds with something that they don't want to do, even when they haven't given it a try. I've got lots of year 7s who I'll say, look, do you read? And they'll be like, no, I don't read. It's really boring, this. I don't, like I've got other things I want to do. I want to play games. I'm good at that, right? Whereas it's those very same kids where if I sit down and I make a point of doing this now, is if we finished our work, I'll put it up on the whiteboard so they can read along with me. And I'll read and I'll do all the voices. And it's the same kids that are going, shh, don't disturb Miss. She's reading. She's going to stop reading if you don't. And so it's because they haven't given it a try. I really think that's one of the key things, is maybe parents haven't been into reading.
Right.
And then they've not encouraged their kids to get into it, or they haven't had the time to encourage their kids to get into it. It's time consuming, but it's really rewarding.
And so we also talked about reading for pleasure.
Yeah.
And is that, so there's a difference between reading in terms of this is your homework and reading for pleasure. So how do you bridge that gap?
Reading for pleasure is going to help you in all of your reading for homework. In order to access the vocabulary, access the sentence structure, understand the nuances of language, the more you read, the more sophisticated vocabulary you get to grips with, the more your academic reading is going to become easy. So I would say reading for pleasure comes first and foremost. And from that, you're going to develop your love for, from that, all your academic stuff is just going to get easy. Okay.
So that then begs the question, how do we get our kids interested in reading? That's really the key issue here. If it's and something we'll move on to, I suppose, if it's seen as the preserve of the wealthy, because books are not cheap.
Yeah.
If it's seen as the preserve of people who have got time, and if it's seen as the preserve of those people who have who've got a certain inclination, then are not distracted by other things. How do we overcome all these barriers and actually get them? What is it by example? Is it by making it more accessible? A combination of things, I'd imagine.
So yeah, all of those things. So the cost of books is huge. You could circumvent that by doing things like buying secondhand books. You have sites like World of Books, which sort of you can buy secondhand books from. You can also there's lots of online books which are free. So there's lots of websites which, especially the classics, you can get for free. You could do that. You could also use libraries. Libraries are open again. And a lot of libraries now, I know that was a real sort of barrier for a lot of people, but they've got like a select and collect service. So I would check out your libraries in your local area and get that going again. Another thing you can do is have family time where you're reading. It sounds really kind of archaic, but it's the way that our parents and grandparents and everybody else used to do it. Used to gather around a book and make that the focus of things. And kids love to hear their parents reading. If you're a parent who struggles with reading, because it's something that you feel is really unnatural, get an older brother or sister to do it, and just sit down and all follow the same book. So you put away all your devices, and they see that you value it. Get your hot chocolate out, whatever you're going to have, like post-eat, and then just have family reading time and do all the voices. Make it sound like you love what you're reading, and your kids will. That enthusiasm will then go through to your children.
Okay, so what a question has come through, which actually it's interesting, because the question is, are electronic books better than physical books? But then you said put all your devices down, and now you've got electronic books, and your books are actually on your devices. So this is not a contradiction, but we have to make sure that there is a context to putting the devices down, right? It's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Right, and also I think that they've done lots of research where they found that actually if the kid follows along on a screen, but there's somebody who's saying it out loud, that child will actually make the same progress as somebody who's actually, if they're reading it themselves. So it's not about, necessarily throwing out all these kind of electronic kind of advancements and stuff. You can use it. I still think mums and dads reading to their kids sort of beats all of that, because there's that personal connection, there's that emotional connection to your parent reading to you, which I think surpasses anything else.
Okay, but I mean, just to address the question directly.
Yeah.
Electronic books, are they better than physical? I'm not quite sure what the questioner means by better, but how do you feel when you read a book on a screen compared to turning a page? So
I'm old school. I love. I mean, it's considered bad, but I love breaking the spine of the book, which is I want it to feel like it's my book, right? I want to feel the pages as I'm reading it, so it feels like my personal copy. And that's a really advantage thing to say, right? What if you can't afford your own personal copy and you can't break the spine of a book from a library? So I think if you're lucky enough to have your own book, I don't think there's anything that beats that. Having your own book as a present from a parent is also really it builds like this emotional connection with it as well. But I won't knock electronic books. Some people love it.
Yeah, because it's not just the books themselves, is it? It's the storage of books. If you've got 100 books, where are you going to put them all? Then you have to buy a bookshelf from IKEA or whatever, and you have to have space to put it. So that whole issue of books being the preserve of the wealthy then comes back into it, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that question. And if anybody else has questions, as a reminder, we're on Ramadan Radio London. This is the Midday magazine show with Burhan and with our guest Rifka today. Talking about education, talking about literacy, talking about the importance of reading. If you want to join us, we are on 87.9 FM. You can question us, you can send in questions on Facebook Live and interact with us as much as possible. We're going to bring in our other guests now. Are our guests with us? Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Wa alaikum assalam.
So we have Sister Zahra and Alia. So Sister Zahra is a secondary school English teacher. And Assalamu alaikum, Zahra.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And she's going to be telling us in a moment about some book recommendations from her experience as a teacher. And Sister Alia, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
She's an active member of the parent community at a local Islamic school. And she's going to be talking to us about the wider concept of education not being all about grades, not being all about A-levels and GCSEs and 11 pluses getting into grammar school, and that there's a big wide world of education out there that we need to consider. But let's start with Sister Zahra. So as a secondary school English teacher, with all the kids in your class, you must experience some feedback from them in terms of which books they're enjoying, which books they're not enjoying, which books you are recommending to them depending on the year groups. Can you share some of your experience with us, please?
Yeah. So with both like girls and boys, I've realized that they all like a series of books. For example, like Harry Potter. I don't know a single child in my class that hasn't gone to me like, Miss, I haven't read that. They're all, like both girls and boys, they're all interested. And I think Harry Potter is not even just today. Even when I was in school, I was obsessed with it. Like I had like all the different books. With the girls, I've realized one of the authors that majority of like teenage girls, they read Karen Mcmanus. So and it's a series of book again. So there's it starts from One of Us is Lying, and then there's another book called To Keep a Secret, and One of Us is Next. And with this book, it's quite mysterious. It's about teenage girls, like five strangers walking into detention, and 4 walk out alive. And there's always a suspect. So where's the other person? And everyone in this book is a suspect. So there isn't even just one person that you could be like, oh, it must be her. She must have done something. But no, there's more than.
Right.
That's that's book I would recommend for especially like teenage girls. And then we've got Holly Jackson. That's another book. A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, another mysterious book. And it's about a schoolgirl again called Andy Bell, and she was murdered by Southside and the police. So there's all these investigations, and there's another like I realized they're like mysterious, and also like they love a lot of fantasy. And it's not just girls, even the boys as well. I would say they like fantasy as well.
What is it about these books you think which is capturing their imagination? Why is it that? And of course, they're almost recommending them to you because they're enjoying them. What is it about it that is grabbing them? And based on that, what would you then recommend as part of that same kind of genre?
I think what's like drawing them into it is like finding that mystery. So what's going to happen next? Or like filling in those missing blanks, because there's always like something to find out. And I think that's what's drawing them into these books. It's not just like, okay, I'm reading something and I kind of know what's going to happen, but no, there's something bigger each time. Like, for example, if they're reading one series and they go to the second, there's always a bigger thing happening, like a bigger picture. And in terms of like recommendation, one of the books I would recommend is The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. I mean, that's my favorite book. And I know some of, especially like upper key stage 3, they some of them are into like this book. It's only because like it shows you a different world, and it's not just about, you know, this is the normal things. I mean, we don't live in the fantasy world. There's no such thing as fantasy world. Like people do suffer to get to a certain point, and especially when it comes to like GCSE wise, the books are not always like, you know, they don't have a happy ending, not all the time. So it gets them prepared. It kind of gets them prepared that, okay, there might not be a happy ending, but there's always something behind that story.
And who's the author for that? So
The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, if I could remember. I will have to
that question.
No, I will. I'll let you know in a bit.
Okay, I'm sure somebody will look it up and.
No, but I wanted to add something to what Zara was saying in terms of books. So she mentioned for Key Stage 3. I'd recommend for Key Stage bottom of Key Stage 3. So your Year 7 kids, Year 8 kids. There's this author called Elizabeth Laird, and I heard somebody on another podcast or webinar recommended, and she writes about places in the Middle East, and she writes a lot about the refugee crisis, and her characters are incredibly kind of emotive, and she's got one called A Little Piece of Ground, which is all about Palestine, and it's an incredibly brave book to have written because there's lots of controversy about whether you should be writing about these topics or not, but it's a really nice way of introducing that to a young audience. I think the character in that is about 13 years old, 12, 13 years old. I read it to my Year 7s and they loved it. Even the kids who said they hated books, they were like gripped, miss, stop, don't stop, don't stop, don't stop. There's another book called A House Without Walls. It's got a female protagonist who's about 13 years old, 13, 14. And it's about a girl from Syria who then has to leave. Her father's a lawyer. They have to flee in the middle of the night.
Same author.
Same author, Elizabeth Laird, and flee in the middle of the night and go to Jordan. Hugely recommend it for parents who want to introduce them to life for Muslims in other parts of the world. It's not written by a Muslim author, but wow, the stuff that she manages to get across is incredibly great.
Okay, excellent. Some good recommendations there. I'm going to bring Sister Alia into the discussion as well now to talk about the wider aspects of education. You're listening to Ramadan Radio. This is the Midday magazine show with Burhan and with Rifka. We're talking reading, we're talking education. You can follow us on Facebook Live. You can message us there, and you can go to ramadanradio.org, the website as well. Sister Alia, you're an active member of the parent community. We've been talking about reading and literacy. Can you tell us how that fits into, from your perspective as a parent, how that fits into your kids' education? Does it play an important part? Does it then feed into the wider aspects of education? What are those wider aspects?
Yes, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I think reading is a very important part, though I put my hand up, my kids were not avid readers at all. It was only like, what the English teacher said, you have to read this book, although I think I bought as many books as I possibly could.
Yeah.
Not go to library. My little one, he had this thing about, people touch this, people touch that. So I actually made a small library in the house, sort of like a library system, so they could get used to it. They started, but I think as they progressed into the years of beyond year 9, and they sort of like drifted away, only doing what was required of them from English curriculum. And they would like hear about books, but they would just read the reviews about it, but not actually read it. I don't know if it's a boy thing. Both of mine are boys, so I don't know if it's a boy thing or. But as compared to one of my friends, she's got 3 boys, but her 2 elder boys, mashallah, they love their reading. They used to do the book trail at library, and mashallah, tabarakallah, their literacy and everything, as Ms. Rifka said, brilliant. It does make such a big difference. And I think my kids felt that when they sat their GCSEs, that they had to like sort of quickly gather all that vocabulary and make themselves in a position where they could obviously sit their GCSEs, do well, do their personal statements, and that follows only going into your A levels. And then because my kids both went to Islamic school, and that was only up to GCSE. So for A levels, they had to go to a different school. So in order for themselves to be not known, but stand out, they had to like regather all that and make them sort of make it a bit more a wider prospects for them. And in terms of overall parenting, I put my kids into everything. I don't know, I was called the OTT parents. You're so extra. That was the word. That you're so extra, mum. So they were at like, I just picked up from school. They used to change the car. They either had tennis, they had cricket, they had swimming, they had everything you could think of. And that was not just because I wanted to push them into that. It's for something, first foremost, which my husband was pretty keen, because he said, force is one thing which kept me, first of all, on the right path, because I didn't have any other distractions. And made me into the person who I am. And as you said, academia is one part, but I think, as you mentioned earlier, brother, that parents put so much emphasis on the 11 plus and the grades and this and that. I understand that's totally important. I mean, I never put my kids to 11 plus because I think that is such a cruel thing to do to your child, because you're constantly at them. And the other thing is, everybody knows your child is set 11 plus. And then everybody wants to know what the result is. And for a child at that age, it's really for them to go through that whole process thinking, oh my God, am I doing it right? And my parents are thinking I should do it right. My brothers, sisters, my cousins, everybody knows about 11 plus. But everybody is different. I'm not saying people shouldn't, because my kids were in the school which I wanted them to go to, so they continued there till GCSEs. But maybe a lot of parents want their children to change the school for obvious reasons. But to putting them into these different avenues, like they did the Duke of Edinburgh as well, it's made such a difference to them, because in the school environment, yes, you have like your sports, but they're not as elaborate as you would take them out, because when they go out, they go to a different club, they meet different people from different countries, and that's how the personality is enhanced. They sort of become more confident in themselves, who they are, as like, you know, for example, prayer time. They know that they had to do the salah, so they used to, like, you know, excuse themselves from the training and go on the side and do the salah. So I think that's very important, because as life goes on, you will have places where you will have to do salah, and if you don't have that strength in you to do it,
that's right.
It's not that you can't make it up, but if you can't do it then and there without disturbing anybody, or, you know, and a lot of people are, you know, accepting that, so it's not a very big deal. And alhamdulillah, my kids have done well. Both are in university now. But I think the main, of course, education was important, but our main focus was to make them into decent human beings. Because if you make children decent human beings who are confident in themselves and know who they are, where their roots are from, everything will naturally, you know, fall into place for them.
Yeah.
And with myself and my husband, one thing we agreed upon, although we come from, you know, two different poles, but we agreed upon our parenting, that whatever we say, we both agree on it. For example, if my children, if I used to do Spanish as well outside of school, I said, oh, like, you know, so why do we have to do Spanish? Nobody else in our school is doing it, and all these things. And when they used to go to the dad, or mom is pushing us to it, they said, just go and listen. What is your mom saying it? That's it. Khalas, you're doing it. That's it.
Yeah,
so there's no, like, you know, so I think that's a very important part as well.
That's a very good.
Yeah, and I think these days, I'm not saying, like, you know, parents are bad. I think it's just that we are giving kids too much power over us. It's like, you know, we have been created as parents for a reason. That's why they say parenting is difficult, because there's so much responsibility on you to make them into the persons that they will become. And it's really important that from day one, I'm not saying like be straight out, like, you know, beat them, you know, do stuff like that and give them punishments all the time. Be their friend, but they should know that their parents are doing what they think is right, because they've got more life experience. We might not have the same education they had and everything, but at the end of the day, it is, you know, we do have more life experience and we can guide them. And I think the whole, the household, the grandparents make such a big difference. And I think that's what children these days are lacking, is that grandparent element.
I think what you've said there, Ali, is really, really important. And you can see it. You see it in the children, like as a teacher, when you see children in school, you'll see children who will know how to speak to a teacher, and they'll know how to speak to their peers, and they'll know how to speak to outsiders who have come in, and all of that training. You're thinking, what is it about this child that he knows or she knows how to speak to all of these different individuals? And it's because they've had that training of mixing with lots and lots of people through their family environment, and that tolerance that you have with maybe dealing with elders, and that respectful tone that you know that you need to have in your voice, and you know that you can't speak to a certain person, and you can also tell those children who have been led very sheltered lives and who've been treated like, you know, like they're kings and queens in their own little kingdom, because then when they are told something, the reaction that comes from them is like, whoa, like, understand your environment, read the room, you know, and they don't have that skill to read the room. So I think it's incredibly important, Alia.
Just to go back to Zara for a second, I had a question which just popped into my head, because you all mentioned that, you know, Alia mentioned as well about the kids in an Islamic school, etc. Going back to reading and books, etc. A lot of these books will have what we would consider inappropriate content. How do you deal with that, Zara? Does that mean you as a teacher have to read all the books beforehand and then kind of pre-warn them, or some of the most popular books or some of the most popular writers, and in TV shows as well, you know, it's like 90% of it's fine or 95% of it's fine, and then there's just one silly scene, and it kind of means that you can't watch any of it. Is that the same? You find the same in books?
Yes, it does happen in books, but with books, for example, Key Stage 3, so if we've got like year 7s and then maybe a year 9, I would also always like let them, okay, 14 plus, you can only read that. I mean, it's not good to restrict it, but it depends. Like And it depends on the parent as well. Some parents don't mind their child reading some books. I've got some students that have told me, Miss, we've read that book, and I was like, oh, and they were like, oh, with our parents' permission, and I'm like, okay.
Right.
So it depends on the parent as well. But as a teacher, I would always say, okay, maybe this book is not appropriate for you. There's an alternative.
Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily mean I have to read every book, but I have to have like some sort of awareness. Okay, what age group is appropriate to read that book, for example?
So it's just an issue of flagging it up rather than censoring or anything like that.
I think another thing that I always tell my little kids is, when I'm saying little kids, I'm talking year 7, right? Is so if they'll say, oh, Miss, but that had this in it, and I'll say, well, you know, life is always going to have things in it which you disagree with. As Muslims, we're always going to encounter things out in wider society that you disagree with. However, you have to look at it through the lens and the filter of Islam. Is this something which is permissible? Is this something which is allowed? Is this something which this person is doing? How do I feel about that? And actually, you'll find that it raises lots of discussion points, which is why I really recommend parents know what their kids are reading and then have like almost like a mini book club with their kid about it. Raise the themes and ideas which come up, even if they're controversial, at least they can discuss it with you, and they can come to you about topics which are slightly dodgy, and then you can give them the Islamic perspective and you can have a discussion and they can go away feeling clear-headed about it. So I wouldn't recommend, I mean, it's a personal take, but as a teacher, I wouldn't go around censoring. I would say, let's discuss it, I think.
Okay. We've had another question come through. The question is, how can I manage the guilt of not spending my time reading Islamic books? So there is this kind of idea within Muslim families that, you know, of course we should read the Quran, we should be reading the Sirah and all these books. And sometimes there is the perception that if you're reading a novel, especially sort of, or even a non-fiction book, you know, like a book about history or a book about a biography, if you're not reading, if it's not the biography of one of the Sahaba, then why are you reading it? I suppose, do you want to just have a quick take on that? But I think that would be interesting to hear both the parent perspective on that as well as the teacher perspective. So
I would say read both, and anytime you read, all your reading is helping you because it's helping develop your criticality. Right, there's no point in you're not reading it like to absorb and, like, you know, take everything that's being said to you without thinking about it. The point is, even if you're reading about the biography of somebody who's, you know, maybe an awful character or awful human being, you're still being able to read about their life and then filter and say, okay, what life lessons can I learn from this? So you're constantly learning through the filter of Islam the whole time, even if the material that you're reading is not particularly, you know, an Islamic text. So it's all valuable. Sister
Alia, have you come across that?
Yes, I mean, not in my household, but like, you know, I've had like people ask me, like, why do you let your child read this? Or as Rifka said, it's a very important learning curve for children. I mean, there's shielding and there's too much shielding.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, because at the end of the day, they will go out into the world. They will meet different people. You can't like keep on protecting them, and when they go out, everything is a shock to them and they don't know how to like respond to it. Or like, you know, I mean, we've taught them all about Islam, but we haven't taught them how to, like, you know, enhance their characters as such, as to like when someone asks you, or like if there's if I can call it a difficult conversation, for example, how do you like respond to it? So as I said, I mean, all these things are very important. Besides, as said, the academic, and reading books is one of those things as well, books which are non-Islamic. So why should always, I'm not saying don't read Islamic books, but why should it be always Islamic books? There's so much to learn out there. It's like about the author Miss Rifka has just mentioned. She sounds like, I've not read any of her books, but she sounds really brilliant. I mean, being a non-Muslim, she's writing such wonderful things. So it just shows that there's so many things out there which our kids can learn from, and it's not really not necessarily, oh, it has to be Islamic. But you can tune it in a way that that, you know, take out the good things, and anything bad that it's like, you know, we read about Shaitan in the Quran. What do we learn from him? That what he does is wrong. So it's, you know, it's sort of like, is there anything? Yeah.
To the point that when you're reading, it's not just the benefit you're getting is not just the content, right? Like you're saying, it's the language, it's the creativity of the author, it's other things apart from just the content. So there's a lot of benefit as Muslims for us to read things which are outside of just kind of dini kind of text, right? There's a lot you can still learn.
And there's just in terms of school life at the moment, there's this massive focus on cultural capital, right? So is your school developing the cultural capital of this child? And the idea is that children who come from well-off backgrounds, they get all this cultural capital by the fact that their parents are sitting around the dining table having this intellectual talk, the fact that they're watching documentaries, the fact that they're visiting magazines and all the rest of it. And one of the ways that kids who don't have all of that naturally can then grab some cultural capital is through reading, is through having a wider knowledge. And actually you'll find that if you get to sixth form and then at work and other places, and you don't know about things outside of your narrow viewpoint, it actually, you're not going to look like, what have you measured what you believe up against, right? Yeah. What have you, where's your evidence?
Challenge. Yeah. So from your experience, Sister Zara, what your interaction with parents, what would you advise the parents of the kids at the school at the moment? How can they participate in getting their kids to not just read? I know that's the topic they were talking about at the moment, but also what Sister Ali was saying. How can they get more involved with a school? How can they get more involved in the wider aspects of their kids' education? And the parental role is more than just dropping off, picking up, and making sure they do their homework, right?
I would say, firstly, building connection with their child. So, for example, there are some parents who just drill their child. They're like, "Oh, do this, complete this," and even through like parents' evening, I've realized that some parents are like, "Okay, so you said reading helps, but in which ways, or how do I go about it? So how do I encourage my child?" There was a parent, I was like, "Oh, is there a particular, I don't know, do you read a book?" And she was like, "Oh, I used to read it, but not anymore." So I was like, "Why don't you find a book that you might enjoy and maybe discuss it with your child and start some kind of interest through there?" Or another thing I would say is, children, they should share the books they read. For example, I think that would be fantastic. Not only would the child benefit, and I also think like parents should also, join that. I know some parents don't read, but I feel like they should join that, whether it's like a reading circle or something.
Yeah,
even in, like, in schools.
A library that she has at school. Have you come across that with other parents as well? Maybe Alia could expand on that for us as well.
So in terms of the library, so the school. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. No, please go ahead, Ms. Westasti. Go ahead.
The library. So they are aware of it. They are aware. So they were like, they are aware of it. But yeah, do you want to go? Okay. Sorry.
Yes, they are aware of it, but I think it's not being used as it should be. I mean, if you've got the facility, like I think last time we only had one girl who was like really wanted to get a book, and even her parent called in saying, "Please, can my child?" And it was one of the classes which had not fully organized their library yet, but still her parents were so adamant that we got her 2 books from the general library downstairs. So we had, and as I said, it's like we've got the facility, but I don't think it's being used to its potential.
You have a library sort of project at school as well, right?
So we're just starting up a library. So this is like, we're right at the infancy of having a library in our school, and it's actually quite a challenge because it's not just about having the physical books in place. It's about having a change of culture so that children are desperate to grab the next book. And I think part of that is reading extracts, letting the kids know what the books are actually about, because while the cover's closed, it's like, unless they're grabbed by the picture at the front, it's dead to them. You need to make the books feel alive. And there's so much that's happening now in terms of literature where authors are they see this kind of gap in terms of children wanting to read. And so you've got things like novels in verse, which have come out, which are like basically novels which are all done in poetry. And whilst that sounds like a lot of work, it's actually really easy, because it's like a train of thought, a sort of stream of consciousness, and you basically get to read what the person is feeling as they're going through the entire story. and really innovative topics. Like there's one called A Long Way Down. Long Way Down? I think it's called Long Way Down, which is about a boy who's trying to decide whether to seek revenge on the person that's killed his brother. And he's got to make the decision from the time he enters the elevator to 2 minutes later when he leaves. And every single page is like a different thought that's going through his head. And as he reaches each floor on the elevator journey going down, he meets other people from his neighborhood who have either died or been killed as a result of gang violence.
Right.
It is so innovative and cool. And like, you can imagine if you're like 13 years old, your jaw's going to drop to the floor. It's like, wow, how cool is this? Clever. And so, and you have lots of other things that happen. Graphic novels are another way of getting kids into reading. So I would, it's something that we would kind of balk at, and that's not a real book. But it's if you can get your young boy into graphic novels, that's going to be his like stepping stone to actually getting into other story worlds. Just very quickly, this is a massive thing which is in the media at the moment. There's a woman called Cressida Cowell who wrote that How to Train Your Dragon book / film, right? But she's a children's laureate,
yes,
right? And she's basically she started this campaign saying she wants every single primary school in the country to end up with a library, because we have so many schools which don't have libraries. And like a quirky fact that's being thrown around is that it's imperative for every prison in the country to have a library, but not every school in the country to have a library, which I find really, really shocking, because you'd think, what are we doing? We know that we can see the value of books and how important it is in terms of changing offenders round.
Yeah.
But we're not providing that for our children. Like, what's wrong with us? So, you know, inshallah, it's my aim to make reading front and center for every single child. And I think if everybody does that and sort of sees the value of it, it'd be fantastic.
Okay, so we've got about 2-3 minutes left. So after this show, we have the Dhuhr Adhan coming up. And then after that, we have Sharmeen. We'll also be talking about parenting. Then we're talking about sort of parenting in the 21st century, what the difficulties are, what the challenges are with brother Shoaib Iqbal. And so we hope that you will continue to listen in, continue to tune in for that. So after our show. And then the next edition of the Midday magazine is on Sunday. So this show goes out on Sundays and Wednesdays at midday. So the next edition is coming up on Sunday at 12 p.m. And we'll be talking to some people who have made the trip from the UK to Turkey, who have relocated to Istanbul. And they are actually on our show last Ramadan. So it's going to be kind of an update of they've now been there for almost 2 years. So we're talking about what it's like to be an expat, why people choose to become an expat in the Muslim world seems to be an increasingly popular thing, what life is like there, talking about schooling, education, food, all those kind of things. And you can dial in then and join us on Facebook Live and put your questions to me and to them on Sunday. But for the time being, final thoughts, please, from our guests, from Zara. Final thoughts on book recommendations and reading.
Oh, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is written by Boyne. He's called I had to quickly but in terms of like book recommendations, I would say a lot of kids like a collection of like the series. That's what they're into. So for example, like Alex Rider, maybe the Hunger Games. So that's what they're into. And parents should encourage their children, even if they see them like reading for a little bit. Don't stop them. Let them. Let them just like continue.
Excellent. Alia, last final thoughts from yourself around wider aspects of education.
Yes, please do let your children grow in their personality. Don't just make it all about grades. And yes, those will come. If they have a good personality and they've got good family atmosphere around them, they'll inshallah, they'll thrive, inshallah.
Inshallah. And that's not to say that grades are not important, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, grades, as I said, grades will come along, inshallah. As if they've got a healthy character, they've got parents, and they've got good family backing, and the parents know, as Ms. said, know what your children are reading. If you know about your children, then they'll prosper anyway, inshallah.
Excellent. Final thoughts,
Stop scrolling, start reading.
Yep.
And slightly longer thoughts because we've still got a little bit more time.
So this is something that I was watching this webinar of this other brother who reads loads and loads, like 100 books a year or something, and he said if you swap just 15 minutes of scrolling time for reading, you can get through about 9 to 10 books a year. And if we consider just how much time we waste, I'm guilty of doing this on Twitter. I'll look at like sort of education Twitter and basically just scroll and be thinking to myself, well, I'm not wasting time because actually anything I learn on here, I'm going to be implementing. So it's not a waste of time. But actually, I did that consciously where I thought, well, I'm just going to read for half an hour. I've got through so many books just in the last few months. So I would just totally recommend it.
And do you have book recommendations as well?
So book recommendations. So I would say try those novels in verse. So people like Alexander Kwame booked. It's all about football. If you've got a reluctant boy reader, then I would really recommend things like that. Girls, just Elizabeth Laird is fantastic. So anything by her.
Okay, and for perhaps the older kids, quickly. 20 seconds on kind of like A-level.
Older kids, I don't know about A-level, but I would recommend anything Zara said about all of those series of books. They're really, and the best thing about them is they're cheap, right? You can buy box sets for not very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our guests. Jazakallah khair. This has been the Midday Magazine Show, and inshallah, we'll see you again on Sunday at 12 p.m. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.